library is located on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We also acknowledge First Nations people's rich history of knowledge keeping and knowledge management, that of course is an inspiration to us all. Just before we start, a couple of housekeeping announcements. The bathroom is located basically on the other side of that wall, so you go out the door you came in and go around into the corridor, and there's bathrooms through there. And emergency exits, there's one again back through the door that you came in and down, and also through these double doors here until the end of the passageway. And of course, if there's an emergency, our staff will make sure we get out of the building safely. This year, the library turns 170, so it's a momentous occasion for us. It marks our 170th anniversary. We were established in 1854, and we're the second oldest library in Victoria. We have a collection of over 40,000 items and take great pride in being the sole library in Australia with such an extensive collection that's actually available for loan, so you can take them home and read them. And our focus is very much on local history, and we house a wealth of information encompassing most towns in Victoria. Now, Ellen tonight at the back and Jade here are taking photographs and videos during tonight's event, and we use that for promotional purposes, and also you'll be able to view this talk tonight on our YouTube channel, and you can access that through a link on our website, or anybody you know that might be interested, you can give them the link as well. If you prefer not to be photographed in any way, let us know and we can make sure we accommodate that. So I'd like to welcome Carmel Mackenzie, who is the author of St Kilda, 1841 to 1900, Movers and Shakers and Money Makers. And that's the subject of your talk tonight. And we should also celebrate that Carmel won recently the Victorian Premier's History Award category of the Victorian Community History Awards with this book. And it's an absolutely beautiful book. And according to the Royal Historical Society of Victoria, the book is social history at its very best and a worthy winner. So make sure you do have a look at it. And welcome, Carmel. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, and welcome all. And it gives me so much pleasure to be here tonight because I conducted quite a bit of research for the book in this library and came across some absolute gems that were in no other library, nowhere else to be found. So some of you may be wondering why I've started the book at 1841. The reason is that that is the first European settlement of St Kilda. I have researched the pre-European settlement, but I'm not a First Nations person, and I don't think I'm really entitled to tell the pre-European story. I'm also very conscious, of course, that in First Nations culture, oral history is so important, and I think we've got to be very conscious of the fact that even if we research something, we don't know, whether or not what is printed is as comprehensive as the oral histories that, unless I've got a connection, a personal connection, we're obviously not privy to. So that just explains why I've started in 1841. Now, the book itself takes a chronological approach. Starts in 1841, and I divided up into 5 chapters that represented 5 distinct phases in St Kilda's history. And I believe that you can, as opposed to a thematic approach, which is quite common in community history, I believe the chronological approach far better reflects the rather extraordinary rise and the spectacular fall that occurred in St Kilda in the 1890s. And I won't have time to go into that tonight, but that's why when you actually trace it back, it's explained in the book. That is why St Kilda is so very, very different to places like South Yarra, Toorak and Kew, etc. today. So when I thought about what approach I'd take tonight, I'm not going to try and summarise the book because it just won't work. So I took my inspiration from the 19th century cabinet of curiosities that many of you will be familiar with. The learned gentlemen, the gentleman scientists, etc. of the day made their habit to collect things that were unusual, or esoteric, or historical, etc. So I just thought, well, inspired by that, I've just picked out some things that intrigued me, surprised me, puzzled me, and in some cases, frankly, disturbed. And not only did disturb me, but continued to disturb me. So it'll be a bit of a grab bag. I'll go through some of the characters that defined the character of St Kilda, the so-called movers and shakers and moneymakers. I'll look at some of the risks and hazards in St Kilda, which surprised me. I'll talk about some of the staggering wealth, and I'll also look at cover the Indigenous, and I'll wind up with some comments on the challenges of researching women in the 19th century. So I'm going to start with some of the people. Now, some of these are mentioned in passing in the book, but I didn't, in many cases, have time to go. It wasn't so much the time, it was I didn't go into detail in the book because if you veer too much into some of the individual accounts, things can get a bit meandering. But when we go through the people, I hope you'll be able to see collectively why St Kilda is so staggeringly different to suburbs, the 19th century history of suburbs like Port Melbourne or Williamstown, which were very much blue collar, or Paran or South Melbourne, which tended to be dominated by shopkeepers and tradesmen and things like that. St Kilda was, for most of the 19th century, up until about the early 1880s, was the wealthiest suburb in Melbourne. Now, to put that in perspective, as many of you probably know, in the 19th century, for much of the 19th century, Melbourne, on a per capita basis, was the wealthiest suburb, the wealthiest city in the world. So it's no surprise that some of the leading lights in St Kilda were able to marry off their sons and daughters into the British aristocracy. I think many of us are familiar with the American fishing fleet, of the Gilded Age, who married their children into the British aristocracy because they needed the money. And believe me, some of the money in St Kilda was certainly right up there with, as I say, enough to make them an alluring prospect for some of the strugglers in the British aristocracy. So in the book, when I was choosing who to include and what to include, I limited myself largely to the lives of the people when they were in St Kilda. So what I'm going to give myself leave to do tonight is to talk about the backgrounds of some of the people before they came to St Kilda, because that'll give you, I think, truly flesh out just how remarkable the history of St Kilda is. So I'll start with Sir George Stephen. So Sir George Stephen came up to Australia in Melbourne in 1855, and he was the first person knighted by Queen Victoria in 1838 for his crusade against slavery. He grew up in St Kitts in the West Indies, came from a very privileged and very distinguished family. He studied medicine at Cambridge before switching to law, and eventually wound up in moving to St Kilda because his two sons had emigrated here. But that is just the starting point for the sort of people that ended up coming out to St Kilda. As I say, not just knighted by Queen Victoria, but the very first person, and obviously for something as momentous as the abolition of slavery. And the slavery connection is interesting. Slavery was abolished in the British colonies in 1833. And when we look at where people came to from St Kilda, I've tracked back quite a few who came from Jamaica, British Guiana, trying to think of some of the Antigua, etc. And of course, this is generally all connected with they came from wealthy plantation families, and that all collapsed in a heap when slavery was abolished. So we have, as I was going through these people, so when you tend to think of, local history, so suburban history, as I say, you tend to think of what people are doing, when they're in situ. And when I started to look at the interconnections between these people, where they came from, who they knew, it's just startling to find out who their parents might have been, who their connections were, who they were connected to. And it gives a real insight into a lot of the global and social upheaval that was happening, particularly in the 1850s, 1860s, and 1870s. Because some of these people clearly weren't just coming to St Kilda, they were coming from conditions that drove them to emigrate from where it was they lived. So a good example of that is Gustav Tichar. And there's a fabulous photo in the book of a gym that Gustav Tichar established on the Esplanade in 1860. So it turns out that he was a Prussian military officer. Again, back in those days, you bought your military commissions, came from quite a wealthy family. And he was present at the Berlin Arsenal in the uprising of 1848, when citizens protested against the revocation of the German constitution and the dissolution of the assembly. So Tichar refused to fire on the assembled crowd. He basically was then guilty of insurrection. So he fled the country, in fact, initially fled to Bavaria, where he became a commander of revolutionary forces. He was sentenced to prison in absentia, fled to Switzerland, and then he made his way to London, where I was intrigued to find he had dinner on at least one occasion with Karl Marx, and they spent a very animated evening together, drinking port, wine and champagne. So it sort of suggests to me they just progressively raided the entire liquor cabinet. And he became a great admirer of Marx, and we know that Karl Marx, on at least one occasion in 1860, wrote, courtesy of the Royal Hotel on the Esplanade, to Gustav Tichar. There are actually quite a few in Victorian history, quite a few connections to the German uprising, other people who came out here driven by the same thing. In the same vein, and as I refer to in the book, we tend to think a lot of people who came out in the 1850s were impecunious, people driven here by the gold rush, so-called shaking off the shackles, the economic shackles that they faced. And my contention is that a lot of the people who came out and settled in St Kilda during the 1850s and 1860s were definitely extremely well educated, and I think a lot of them were driven as much by adventure as the prospect of financial gain. But financial gain does come into it, because many of you will be familiar with the British system of primogeniture, whereby the eldest son in the family inherits the land and the property. So that forces the second and subsequent sons to find a profession and establish themselves in some way. So we find a lot of them coming out to Melbourne, quite a few settling in St Kilda, and certainly we see a lot of connections to the aristocracy, so second and subsequent sons of the aristocracy. So another adventurer was William Embley, who set up in the move to St Kilda. He actually moved to St Kilda in the 1880s, came to Melbourne in 1863. And again, a very romantic figure. He was the son of an English politician. He was educated at boarding schools in Germany, and then transferred to London University, where he fell in with what are known as the red shirt supporters of Garibaldi, who was the Italian hero and revolutionary, ultimately responsible for unifying Italy in 1861. So when the college professors at London Uni found out what Emmeline was up to, they kicked him out. He then went and fought in the Wars of Italian Unification and eventually decided to come to Melbourne, where apparently he gave several riveting lectures on his exploits in the Italian Wars. He ended up distinguishing himself as a resident surgeon at Melbourne Hospital. Another character with a revolutionary past and a real polymath is Orion Horn. Now, he was brought up by his rich English grandmother. He attended Sandhurst Military College, but left to fight in the, believe it or not, the Mexican Wars of Independence in 1821, presumably as some sort of mercenary. I think he was probably seized by romantic intents. Now, prior to coming to Australia, Horn was a London-based dramatist, poet and author. His close friends included philosophers, economists, politicians, scientists, and he was a very close friend of the poet Elizabeth Barrett Browning. He also wrote for Charles Dickens' serialised newspaper Household Words, and in fact co-wrote with Dickens, so obviously knew him very well. And he came up in June 1852 to join the gold rush, as left us some very interesting accounts of early Melbourne. And he was that true bohemian, a drunk and a womanizer, and he lived in Rose Street, St Kilda, for much of the. I mean, he's a fabulous character. His photos of him, there's a long mad curls, and it apparently flouts around Melbourne in a rather spectacular cape, clutching his guitar. So another connection, another man who incidentally has a connection with Dickens as well, and that is Archibald Mitchie. And there are several characters from St Kilda that I would love to have been able to have a chat to, and Archibald Mitchie is right up there in the top few. He was truly a Renaissance man, very well educated, attended the Westminster School in London. His alumni include Christopher Wren, the dramatist, Ben Jonson, the philosopher Ben Locke, and many of the scions of the aristocracy. So it gives you some idea of his background. He was a lawyer who came out to Sydney and settled in St Kilda in 1854. While he was in St Kilda, he continued to correspond with his friend in London, the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who was a philosopher and political economist. And he also continued to correspond with Charles Dickens. So he actually ended up writing some accounts of his life in 1850s Melbourne for Dickens' Household Words. And Dickens was apparently concerned, or was concerned, that some of his children, particularly his son, seemed to be destined to become idlers. So he gave a couple of them a big nudge that they were to head out to the colonies, and Archibald Mitchie actually set up one of Charles Dickens' sons, Tennyson, I believe it was, in a job in Melbourne, and Mitchie invited Dickens to come to Australia. Dickens declined. There's a very interesting letter to this effect in the State Library of New South Wales. Incidentally, of the two of the Dickens sons that did actually wind up living in Australia, one of them ended up educating, Alfred, ended up educating his daughters, Kathleen and Violet, at Oberwell, an ladies' academy, which was in Burnett Street, St Kilda. And those of you who know St Kilda may know the lovely mansion Oberwell still stands in the corner. So another scion of wealth, Judge Charles Skinner. And this time we're moving away from Europe, but we're ultimately heading to an India connection. So Charles Skinner was raised believing he would inherit the family fortune. and grew up on ancestral estates in Surrey, where the exiled Emperor Napoleon used to indulge him in piggyback rides as a boy. So he studied law at Cambridge merely because that was what gentlemen did. He didn't actually expect to have to work for a living, but that all evaporated when his father blew the family fortune in the silver mines of Venezuela. So he travelled to India, where he became a lawyer, and his clients included the Maharaja of Tripura, who apparently lavished Charles Skinner with incredible gifts that he brought out to Melbourne in his luggage, and I wonder what they were and where they are now. So not all of them came from those sort of backgrounds, but as you'll see there, as I said, some of these I don't mention in the book, there are others I do mention in the book, and believe me, there's a whole catalogue of them that gives you, proves that these people were far from the exception. But some certainly rose from humble backgrounds, and one who I think would be very embarrassed when his humble backgrounds were revealed, because he was a very pretentious man, was Peter Davis, who was the Mayor of Melbourne in 1856 and 1857. Now, we know about his background, which, as I say, I'm sure he would have liked to have remained concealed, due to a scandal that erupted when, back in those days, the Mayor of Melbourne was also the Chief Magistrate. And Peter Davis was presiding over a case and declared that he disbelieved the testimony of one of the people, purely on the basis that this man was Jewish. So this erupted in the press, and the reporters went looking for dirt on Davis, and they were delighted when they were able to reveal that Davis, who pitched himself very much as a pillar of society, was formerly a butler in Government House in New South Wales, and they derided him as, quote, a cleaner of spoons, a burnisher of plate, and a bootblacker. So another one who rose from very surprising beginnings was Octavius Brown, who bought I think what probably, had it not been demolished, the largest and grandest of the St Kilda mansions, which was named Charnwood and stood at the corner of Alma Road and what is now St Kilda Road. So Octavius Brown was one of, I think it was 15 children living in England when his father did a run-up. His father actually became bankrupt, abandoned the family and fled to America under an assumed name. So leaving his mother destitute with 15 children to raise. And he did have some, as a child, after his mother was left destitute, he did have some help from extended family members who were reasonably prosperous. But nevertheless, I give him full credit for what he was able to achieve coming out to Melbourne. He set himself up as a shipbroker, pastoralist, a shipbroker, and in passing, one of the things I found interesting about his shipbroking activities was one of the things he imported was Chinese labour, given the labour shortage during post-gold rush. So there's a slight taint to some of his wealth, but I must admit I'm still a great admirer of his. And interestingly enough, we have another Dickens connection here, because his brother, and I say brother in inverted commas, because it turned out his brother Hadlow, it was actually really his nephew, because it was a closely kept secret that Hadlow was really the son of his unwed sister, who was brought up as a brother. But anyway, he became the illustrator His, who, those of you who are fans of Charles Dickens' works will know that His illustrated most of his books. So I'm inclined to think that Dickens would have known a lot about early St Kilda, because I think he would have heard about it through from Phiz, from Octavius, etc. But we'll never know for sure because Dickens actually burnt all of his correspondence a year before his death. So now I'll give you a spectacular fall from fortune. As I say, Octavius Brown left Charnwood, the mansion Charnwood, after he'd amassed a fortune and went back to England. And the next owner was a Scot by the name of Matthew Harvey, who came out to New South Wales in 1838. So he bought Charnwood in 1854 for £30,000, which was, to put the grandeur of Charnwood in perspective, it served briefly as Government House in Melbourne when the Government House in Toorak was being renovated in the 19th century. He was 34 when he bought Charnwood, and I point that out because one of the things that really struck me is how young a lot of the men were when they bought or built mansions in St Kilda. So a lot of them were in their 20s or in their 30s. And as you know now, typically people in their even 30s are still at home trying to save up for a deposit on a modest apartment. But it gives you some indication of the phenomenal risks that people were prepared to take in those days, and some of them paid off spectacularly. So let's take a look at some of the risks that made Matthew Harvey rich and ultimately brought him undone. So Charnwood was described as one of the most noble-looking and tasteful properties in the colonies. Matthew Harvey owned 17 pastoral properties, as I say, at the age of 34, not bad going. Kangaroos and emus grazed in its grounds, and I've come across quite a few, I think probably about 5 instances of people who had kangaroos or wallabies or emus of the like grazing in the grounds of the mansions in St Kilda, particularly along Alma Road in East St Kilda, where the blocks often ran to the grounds often ran to about 15 acres. One account of a dinner party that Matthew Harvey threw alleges that guests dined off solid gold plates, and again he was a very ostentatious man. There's a picture of him in the book there, dressed in the finery of the Victorian Yeomanry Cavalry, which he was an officer. Now, the Yeomanry Cavalry, membership was open to, basically, theoretically, open to any man who could afford the uniform and his own horse. So what Harvey and the members of the Yeomanry Cavalry did was design a prohibitively expensive uniform that cost £33, which is the equivalent of a wage for a general servant, and it was a spectacular uniform with a plumed helmet and lavish gold braid and a sword, etc., etc. And to put it in perspective, the uniform of the other more common St Kilda militia cost £3. So, given the risks that, given his wealth, Matthew Harvey was duly elected to Parliament, served in Parliament until it was 1870, when he, after his investments turned sour, and if you were bankrupt, you then had to resign from Parliament. But things got worse, and in 1872, he accepts a position as an inspector of scab, which is a cattle disease out near Benalla, and is ultimately found dead, clinging to a fence. The post-mortem description of malnutrition and excessive drinking, pointing to the sadness of his final years, and his widow and family were left at the mercy of a public appeal. Now, remember I mentioned a lot of the junior scions of the aristocracy came up. Well, Matthew Harvey's business partner was actually the son of Lord Henry Cockburn, former Solicitor General of Scotland. He also lived in Alma Road, and unfortunately died almost as tragically as Matthew Harvey by committing suicide in 1871 by drinking a liniment containing belladonna. So that gives you some insight into the backgrounds of some of the movers and shakers in St Kilda. And now I'll turn to something that is quite random, but again intrigued me. And that was, given the lifestyles a lot of these people could have pursued back in America, Canada, we had quite a lot of people come out from India where they'd been serving in the British military. So given the lifestyles, I still find it interesting that you think, well, they must have had it easy, and they didn't. So when in the book I describe the early settlement of St Kilda in the 1840s, and the people who moved from Melbourne, given that these were very wealthy people in many cases and owned some of the best houses in Melbourne, decided, once land was opened up in St Kilda, to move to what was then a very isolated place. So bear in mind that there's, until 1845, they've got to cross the Yarra on a punt, which occasionally sank. There were no police, there were no shops, there were no doctors, there was no chaplains. It was a pretty hazardous and often very uncomfortable place, even for the wealthy. So I cover, in the book, I talk about the bandits that were a particular problem during the gold rush years, the largely Bantamanian convicts. In about 1853, 1/10 of the population of Melbourne was either a runaway convict or a discharged convict. And given the wealth in St Kilda, it was St Kilda Road and St Kilda itself were popular places to hold people up. And I also cover some of the smuggling activities that occurred on St Kilda Beach. But some of the others are, the roads were an absolute disaster. And there were quite a lot of instances of, there were tree stumps in the middle of the road, and bearing in mind you've got no road lights and no street lighting at this point. So it was quite common for people to be badly injured when they were driving their carriage or their gig to or from St Kilda. So the editor of the Melbourne Argus, the newspaper, he broke his leg when his gig hit a bad ruts in the road on down in St Kilda way. We've got another one, Emergent R.P. Mervyn. I rather like his account. He wasn't injured, but he was badly bruised when he was thrown clear after the gig he bought for the fine sum of 40 guineas the day before broke both of its springs or both of its axles, and he fell out. And then in 1857, things were still a problem when the chairman of Public Works was disgusted by the fact that a hole or crater, 5 foot deep, 5 foot wide and yards long, was allowed to remain on St Kilda Road between Alma Road and Inkerman, I think it was. And I suspect it was that hole that probably overturned the omnibus that Melbourne's chief librarian, Augustus Took, who lived in St Kilda, was travelling in, and he was badly injured. There was no water in St Kilda other than a subterranean stream, so you think, again, very difficult to settle in a place without a river or a creek nearby. So a lot of the water had to be, generally, was carted in. So to save and it was very expensive. So to save on the cost of importing water, what a lot of people did to water their gardens and their horses was to excavate ditches in their gardens. And it's just phenomenal how many drownings occurred as a result of that, including one of the 3-year-old daughter of the mayor of St Kilda, drowned in 1865. Now I mention that because, just so happens, the next mayor of St Kilda actually died in tragic circumstances, and people must be thinking, what is it with the mayors? So in 1867, the mayor of St Kilda, I've forgotten his name, he's in the book, he died after catching his foot in the steel hoops of his wife's crinoline outside their Alma Road home. and he tripped and died from injuries sustained in the fall. So still on the subject, I know we shouldn't laugh. It is bizarre. So still on the subject of crinolines, which amuses me, is that they've also used to conceal items that servants in St Kilda stole from their employers. And there's one case of a lass being charged with repeatedly stealing bibs that she hid beneath her crinoline. Again, in the 1850s in St Kilda, you've got a lot of development happening. And imagine right in the centre of St Kilda, if you think of St Kilda Hill today, bound by Burnett Street, Grey Street, Dalgety Street, etc., it's actually lower, considerably lower than what it was in the 19th century, and that's because it was quarried. It's at sandstone, and there were several quarries, which again were sadly a great hazard in St Kilda. So we know one very sad example was a 10-year-old boy, Joseph Pegler, drowned in a quarry near the Junction Hotel in 1856. Then 18 months later, his father died at the same quarry when an embankment collapsed upon him. And despite the best efforts of a neighbour who applied leeches to his thigh and a mustard poultice to his chest, he died. So another one, in the interest of time, I won't go into another one that we tend to forget about, and that is, it wasn't just the hazards that people faced when they got here, it was the hazards that they endured on the way here. So I've come across probably at least 8 or 9 accounts of people being shipwrecked on the way to St Kilda. One person was stranded on a reef outside the heads at Port Phillip Heads on Lone Star Reef in a squall. Others have left behind some extraordinary accounts of sort of mid-sea collisions with other ships that they were very, very lucky to survive, or just maritime disasters. So if anyone does have an interest in maritime disasters, let me know and I can point you in the direction of some quite extraordinary accounts of survivors. So I'll now turn to one of the aspects that I found most disturbing, and that was the treatment, I won't call it the treatment, it was the eviction of the Indigenous owners of St Kilda, the Yalukit Weelam. And I was pretty interested that this hadn't been picked up in much of the other literature, been covered perhaps sweepingly. The relationship between the settlers in 19th century St Kilda and the Yalukit Weelam is very complex, very ambiguous, and the references I found by whites are actually quite fleeting, and either there are other accounts out there that families have destroyed before donating material to the archives, or it's possible that it was simply not really on their radar, and certainly quite a few of the settlers in St Kilda just wanted the Indigenous out of St Kilda. And this becomes really evident in the writings of the Assistant Aboriginal Protector, William Thomas, and Thomas's diaries, very detailed diaries, and reports to Governor Latrobe have been published. And in that, you can see the transition from the 1840s, where he's monitoring the Aboriginal people in and around Melbourne, and in fact across Gippsland as well. But he goes into, talks about several encampments at St Kilda. And so that was the 1840s. And in the 1850s, when you've got, after the gold rush, you've got development in St Kilda proceeding at a very rapid pace. There's a pronounced shift in the entries in his diary, which document, and very uncomfortable they are to read, document the forced eviction. So he would respond, and he would himself strikes me as being a very honourable man with a great empathy for First Nations people, but he was being urged by Governor Latrobe and others to force the Indigenous people onto reservations, including that for the settlement of Nordialloc. So in the 1850s, you can see there's consistent reports about went to St Kilda, found an encampment of blacks. They were being very noisy, forced them to move on, and it goes back the next day, and they go on and on and on. So I do find it surprising that there is so little written, so few first-person accounts of the treatment of the Indigenous written at the time. What is interesting is, I do separately in the book, I won't go into it here, talk about how many of the wealthy squatters in St Kilda were, I think, probably complicit in grave injustices, possibly atrocities against First Nations people that they were evicting off their pastoral runs. But what is interesting is, or separately interesting, is the rise of ethnography from the sort of the gentleman scientist who is interested in what were then regarded as, I guess, quaint cultures. And we get quite a few people in St Kilda who had impressive collections of Indigenous artefacts, and some of whom had a very deep and engaging interest in Aboriginal culture. But it's instructive, I think, that this comes to the fore after the Yalukit Weerum have effectively all but disappeared from St Kilda. I'm very sympathetic to John Lane Curry, who was a Western District pastoralist who established his pastoral runs in 1844. If you know the mansion in Grey Street, St Kilda, called Eildon, that was largely constructed by John Lane Curry, and he is sort of, I think, struck me in his interest in documenting Aboriginal languages. He had a very extensive library that included a lot of information on exploration and First Nations people, and his artwork, again, his collection of artwork, which included Indigenous artefacts that hung in the foyer and things like that, indicates that, he had an abiding interest that continued right through his death. Another one was Edward Migglethwaite Kerr, who lived in Alma Road, and again, he admits that he really became wealthy through the dispossession of the Yorta Yorta people on his pastoral land up near Albury. And he regretted that. And I'll read out a quote from something he said in 1877 when he was living in St Kilda. His testimony to the Royal Commission on Aborigines. And the quote is, his quote, "Were Aboriginal people as valuable commercially as shorthorn cattle or merino sheep, there would be no fear of them dying out. The fact is, we pretended, but never really wished, to save them from extinction." And he did try and, he really spent the remainder of the years up until his death trying to improve the conditions for Indigenous people, but met quite a lot of opposition because he was regarded by some people, including members of the Aboriginal community themselves, he was regarded as being somewhat paternalistic. So there were other people like Joseph Anderson Panton, who explored the Kimberley. He moved to St Kilda in 1881. He explored the Kimberley in the 1850s and early 1860s, went back there in 1883, had an impressive collection, very impressive collection of Indigenous artefacts. Samuel De Beer, a shipbroker, probably represented a different type of collector. I suspect he collected as so-called gentleman collector who was interested in Indigenous curios. And then Then I think one of the most interesting is Professor Walter Baldwin Spencer, who some of you may know, globally renowned as an anthropologist and scientist. He moved to St Kilda briefly in the 1880s and returned in 1896. Stayed there until 1902, although he would have been absent for quite a bit of time because this overlaps with many of his extensive expeditions documenting the culture of the Arrernte people in Central Australia. So he left behind a collection of 60,000 photographs and artefacts, and is a fascinating character. But what I get is, and the point I wanted to make is that all of this is happening in parallel to what is happening, actually has happened right under their noses. And it's sort of the academic interest is peaking once they basically rid St Kilda of the traditional owners. And I'm just left with this troubling sense of objectification. And in the 1870s and the 1880s, I noticed a trend to adopting Indigenous house names. So we start coming across mansions that are named in St Kilda. Names include Murnon, Wilgar, Wingello, Taruna, Mittagong, Iramu, Yanaki, etc. And I presume it was done to sort of telegraph to your neighbours that you were a patriot and a person of learning. And then I came across something from, was a few lines in the Herald from 1935. And even though my book's about 19th century St Kilda, I thought I'd mention them here because, again, it connects to this nostalgia for a lost people without necessarily acknowledging your role in their dispossession. So, and it very much reflects a movement in sort of early and mid 20th century Melbourne. And it suggests, it's an 1835 report, and it suggests that the boys in St Kilda had been told stories by their grandfather, I'd say their grandfathers, who encountered Aboriginal people in the 1840s and 1850s, either in St Kilda or on their rural properties. Now, I'm going to issue a caution here because I've chosen not to sanitise the quote because I think it undermines the very point I'm trying to make. So this is the quote. Boys with stone axes and long wooden spears have been playing blackfellows at St Kilda, and this Stone Age revival looks like extending to other suburbs. The St Kilda tribe, that's the white boys, has made its primitive weapons, the Stone Age axes, most ingeniously. Enough said. So on to a completely separate topic, which is the wealth in St Kilda, which, as I said, was pretty staggering. Now, we have really good insights into the interiors of a lot of St Kilda mansions, and I've only come across a few good photos, one of which is, or a couple of which are in the book there. But the reason we know so much about the interiors is that when people travelled overseas, which they often did for 18 months, sometimes 3 years at a time, it was so expensive to store your furniture, which gives an insight into land values in Melbourne. It was so expensive to store your furniture that you sold it, right? And then you bought more. Often you bought more in Europe and then shipped it home. So that gives us an insight into the amount of furniture that was described in the auction classifieds, and it's made to order, prize winning. We see a lot of ebony and gilt suites, very expensive bedroom suites, covered in the finest silk tapestry, hand painted, oil paintings, pier glasses, Florentine mosaics, Japanese curios, bronzes, superb porcelain vases, etc., etc. One mansion I came across in Alma Road, the auction classified, noted that much of the furniture had been bought from the American tycoon Henry Baldwin Hyde, who owned one of the finest Gilded Age mansions on Long Island. So you can only imagine what some of this, how valuable and exquisite some of this furniture must have been. And it also included, in the same auction, a polar bear rug and mounted stag's heads. Now, I'm going to digress because I became a bit fascinated with this polar bear rug. So I started looking at, you see, a lot of people also came from, as I said, the British Raj and things like that. And if you look at auction classifieds, which I did in Melbourne in the 1840s, it seems around the 1940s, you had this proliferation of polar bear rugs, bearskin rugs, leopard skin rugs, and tiger skin rugs for sale. And my guess is they're being sold off when the people who are living in Toorak and St Kilda and things in the 1880s and 1890s are dying. And I'm just intrigued as to where these all ended up. There was some art was a very important signifier of your learning and wealth. So you typically had your ballroom or your drawing room hung salon style with dozens of artworks, some of which were pretty dubious. But I'm particularly interested in the rise of patronage for Australian artists, such as Louis Bouguereau and Eugene Bongarade, as it indicates a cultural shift in identifying with being an Australian rather than pictures of crumbling castles in Scotland and the like. And some of the collectors in St Kilda had art that would be considered certainly fit for a museum. So I mentioned Archibald Mitchie before, who again I'd like to chat to one day. Had a very fine art collection, including works by Eugene from Garab, the Flemish artist, 17th century Flemish artist Anthony van Dyck, J.M.W. Turner, Thomas of Becket, who also lived in Alma Road, had works by the 17th century French artists Nicolas Poussin, Claude Lorraine, 17th century Italian painters Canaletto, Guido Reni, etc. Now, when you think of, you compare this to some of the baronial houses in the United Kingdom, etc., bear in mind that housing cost in Melbourne cost around 5 times what equivalent properties went for in London, and that items imported by merchants sold in Melbourne for more than 10 times what they went for overseas. So when you look at what is a reasonably modest mansion in St Kilda, as I said, it would be spectacular by its time. So I'll whip through just a couple of the other examples of wealth. And that was, you look at the balls that occurred in places like St Kilda. One of them, to ensure a literally glittering occasion, mirrors lined the dancing marquee for a party in Alma Road. Hyde helped drape the ceiling with buntings and festoons of foliage. The band set up in an alcove. The house was decked out with an abundance of lush greenery and roses. The billiard table resembled a cool pond covered by a mirror with palms and ferns and pink azaleas and blah, blah, blah. Now, these were always, the social functions were always reported in great detail, particularly in table talk, because it gave, was an indication of your social status and the status of your guests. And there's a very performative aspect to it. And you can see this in particularly things such as the wedding gifts, where one woman I talk about in the book, living in Fitzroy Street, her wedding gifts include a blaze of diamonds and plate. Now, of course, the diamonds are so she can wear them to her ball, and the plate is so that she can entertain in due course. And I traced some of the jewellery, which is indicative of the wealth of some of these families, including in 1888, you start to get the rise of the diamond tiara in St Kilda, in Melbourne, and particularly evident in St Kilda. We get quite a few mentions of women in St Kilda out and about in their diamond tiaras, and again, I wonder where they are now. Now, I won't go into it, but in the book, one of the things that I haven't seen covered anywhere else in any other history book is, on Victorian history, is the snob value in being able to make your debut at Buckingham Palace. And I go through the number of women in St Kilda, several of the women from St Kilda, who travel to England for weeks in advance to be fitted with a lavish gown on a 3-metre train and be decked out in diamonds and a tulle veil and ostrich feather in necklaces, an ostrich feather headdress and things like that. And again, the importance of this, of course, was that until you had made your royal debut in the throne room at Buckingham Palace, you couldn't really be invited to the really select balls and country houses, etc., which was so important if your parents then had designs on marrying you into the aristocracy. So again, surprising. So I'll wind up with some remarks on women, because I don't want to leave you with the impression that some of these women in St Kilda, their life was all about fine jewels and Parisian gowns, and but they lacked intellectual aspirations, or didn't engage in social reform or current affairs. And it's a challenge finding some first-hand material, such as diaries and letters from these women, although they would have been prolific writers and certainly would have kept diaries. But as I say, I've just turned over every archive in the country. I've been looking for them. I found some. But it led me to, I did find some material, but where I found other references to them is in the press. But obviously that is only for women who had a public profile. Now, a public profile would have been an anathema to quite a few of the women in St Kilda social circles. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the author Joan Lindsay, who wrote Picnic at Hanging Rock. She grew up in Carmel Road, St Kilda. And she mentions in some of her jottings, reflecting on her mother's lifestyle, that it was considered good form, particularly for ladies, to be as near invisible as possible to all but relatives, family, and close friends. So where we do get mentions of women in the press is obviously if they're doing something such as setting up the founder and principal of a ladies' school. And it is striking how well educated a lot of these women who set up ladies' academies in St Kilda were. And in the epilogue of the book, I won't go into it here, in the epilogue of the book, I talk about how many of these women in very well brought up households in St Kilda chose not to marry, and I believe it was in many cases probably deliberate. We get quite a lot of this. I've gone into researched quite a few of the schools in St Kilda. But one that I found most fascinating was Fairlight, which was in Alma Road, and the building still stands and is actually used as a boarding house. So this was set up by, I thought to myself, so why would the two women, the Mrs. Chambers, who were they and why did they set up a school? And it turns out they were very much from a family that could be regarded as Australian aristocracy. They were the daughters of a solicitor, and their uncle owned the spectacular mansion Van Ulen that still exists in Heidelberg. So their parents must have been very progressive, because they took the girls the mother took the girls to England in 1853, where they attended a remarkable school set up by one of the pioneers of women's education, women's rigorous education in England, by the name of Dorothy Wheeler, who was intent on teaching women, everything from physics to chemistry to what have you. So I think I forget in total, I think there was something like 53 pupils at the school in total. So the girls who probably, with their father's financial backing, probably could have made a very good marriage in England, but came back to Melbourne and set up this school in St Kilda, and included turned out some extraordinary graduates, female graduates, in the 1880s and 1890s. So I'll just rattle a few of them off. The first woman to study law in Victoria was Ethel Godfrey, graduate of the school, who again lived in Alma Road. And to show just how radical this was to study law as a female in 1895, the first woman in Australia to eventually practice law was Floss Grigg, who set up in 1905. So for some reason or another, Ethel abandoned her studies, but everything about her suggests she and her sister, who incidentally was the first woman to attend Burnie Horticultural College, indicates the extent of their training. Another one, Frances Hines, grew up in a very wealthy St Kilda family. She could have done anything. She was finished at school or had some finishing at European finishing schools. She became a nurse, which would have been, dirty, hard work at the time. And she was the first woman to serve. She volunteered in the Boer War and unfortunately died from overwork, succumbing to pneumonia, and became the first person to die on active service. One of my favourites is Janet Mitchie, again educated at Fairlight, a daughter of Archibald Mitchie. She became an avid Marxist. So I find it fascinating that a woman's sitting there reading Marx in German in St Kilda in the 1860s and remained a vociferous campaign of women's rights right throughout her life. So we also have the first doctors to qualify from the University of Melbourne, came from St Kilda. The first woman to study dentistry comes from a private academy in St Kilda. One of the more extraordinary was the daughter of Graham Berry, Prime Minister, and he lived in St Kilda pretty much his the entire half of the 19th century, second half of the 19th century. And it was said that, I quote, one of Sir Graham Berry's pretty daughters is a constant visitor to Parliament House. She pursues politics closely and is an authority on the constitutional points that have from time to time troubled Victoria. So this again gives you some insight into these women certainly had it easier than their sisters in other suburbs because the servants did the work and the parents had the money to put them through schools and to indulge their interests. But it nevertheless gives some insight into the frustration, intellectual frustration, and the sort of stultifying lifestyle that drew these women to become pioneers of their time. So I'm sorry, I've gone over time. I've been trying to rush it, so I'm going to finish there.
Other questions? Comments?
Did you come across Alexander John Skene?
Yes.
He became, he married my great-great-grandfather's sister, Margaret.
He lived in Alma Road.
Yeah, and I thought it might have been 12 Alma Road. And so I went to the Jewish Museum during Open House Melbourne to see if they had any information about what had been on that site previously, that they didn't. But I read something about him that as Surveyor General of Victoria, explored along Victoria. He worked for about 37 years without taking a holiday. And I thought, what a boring life his wife must have lived.
Did you include, as a matter of interest, Stanley Bruce's father?
Yes,
Also
that's.
Alfred Felton.
Well, I'll deal with Alfred Felton very quickly.
Yeah.
The reason I didn't put Alfred Felton in the book is he moved around St Kilda, quite a lot. He sadly he was clearly a very private man, and my guess is he instructed all his papers and diaries to be burnt or he destroyed them before his death. So we know very little about Alfred Felton as a person. Although I'm quite intrigued by his art collection, and we know a fair bit about that. So, sorry, what was the first one?
Stanley Bruce's.
Yeah. So he, I've forgotten the first name of his father's His father. His father was a very wealthy merchant who lived in St Kilda and was...
Grey Street.
That's right, in Grey Street. And he was a classic case of someone who overextended himself in the 1880s and 1890s. And there are several references in the papers to, he's in Europe, and he eventually ended up committing suicide in rather sad circumstances in Paris.
A lot of these people that you mentioned were educated and moneyed and came from various places and all these wonderful backgrounds. What made them choose St Kilda? Was it to be the like people? Was it proximity to Melbourne and on the water?
Yeah.
What about this area as distinct from any other that would gather the same?
Okay, so St Kilda is geographically unique in sort of around the bay, right? So it is a vast sandstone knoll. In fact, I've got an early map that shows this. So given it's sandstone, it was, and it's the highest point of elevation around the coast. So even though Melbourne was settled in 1838, it very rapidly became filthy. So, there was no sanitation, no sewage collection. The Yarra was polluted by sewage running into through the open gutters. There were pigs and goats foraging through refuse on the streets. It was incredibly dusty, and it was just a disaster. So people wanted to be near the sea, but the government, the government in Sydney basically kept most of the land outside of Melbourne around the bay as Crown land. So you could have just, with the exception of Williamstown and Brighton, incidentally. So there were few places to actually go to get away from the filth of Melbourne and find somewhere nice by the sea. So when in 1841, there was a very, very profound depression, the start of a profound depression, and the government in Sydney found their revenue pretty much halved. So Governor Gibbs, who was actually one of the ways to solve that was by flogging off Crown land. So he selected St Kilda as probably the most attractive place to resurrect Crown land sales. So people jumped on it because it was, as the first chapter in my book, 1841 to 1851, St Kilda was clean, green, and isolated. And it was the land was expensive, and few people could afford to buy other than the wealthy. So the initial buyers set the social tone of the place, which in turn sort of elevated the prices when things recovered. So it was a combination of geographic and social factors, but you've really got to start with the geography to understand it.
And it was the sense of adventure that brought a lot of these people here?
That brought them to Melbourne, but to St Kilda, I think part of it was actually that they wanted to distance themselves from what Marx would describe as the proletariat. Because, it's not a laugh, because the cost of the punt alone, before a bridge was built, the cost of the punt alone, one way, was enough to feed a worker for a week. So it was a very effective social project.
For those people that were wealthy and educated to migrate in the first place and then choose here, would it have been a sense of adventure or something else?
No, as I say, quite a lot of the minor sons of the aristocracy and the professionals and things like that, I think adventure was a significant part of it.
Is that talking about the punt across the Yarra at the bottom of the punt road?
The first, oh gosh, you got me now. That was the second punt. The first punt, and there's a caption in the book on that. The first punt was pretty much where Princess Bridge is now.
Just curiosity, what made you take an interest in St Kilda
Well, I've lived in St Kilda, in East St Kilda,
Ah,
since 1994, and it was just a case of walking around the streets and wondering about the history of some of these old places.
which street?
Hewenden Road. I live in Hewenden Road.
Well, Fulton Street, near.
So that was where much of my Archibald Mitchie lived. Anyway, so
Just as a matter of interest, Sydney Myers' very first home is in Fulton Street, a couple of doors from where I live.
as I say, East St Kilda was amazing. East St Kilda is just off the scale. So it was really a case of just wandering around, and after work, I'd go, rather than sitting at home and watching TV, I just decided something more interesting to do. I'd go to the State Library and research some of these houses. And eventually it grew into a book.
Thank you.
How many of these lovely old homes still exist? The ones that you.
The
I'm
real,
looking, I was
Yeah.
having a look.
Yeah.
And it said, demolished.
and it's interesting how many of them are still being demolished in the 1860s and 1870s, when I think there were 4 major properties in St Kilda, just 4 that had a heritage listing in the 1970s. Alma Road, which, as I said, was the golden mile of Melbourne, not just St Kilda, but Melbourne. That remained an exclusive enclave until around the 1920s, far after St Kilda proper had declined in the 1890s. But then, because of that, you start getting apartment construction occurring in Melbourne in the 1920s. So it's really almost unfortunate that it was the 1920s that these Alma Road properties came onto the market, because it coincided with the boom in apartment construction, and because the really impressive mansions that were in St Kilda. So they're all the ones that have completely disappeared. So.
I'm so glad you did wander around instead of watching television. Absolutely love the stories. So many individual stories. I don't know how you keep it all in your head. There was obviously a whole lot more in there. Thank you so much for your
Thank you,
discussion.
Judy.
And
Thank you, Judy.
enjoy this evening. We have these events every month, sometimes 2. There's also daytime ones. There's a book club. There's a book sale on this Saturday. Is that right?
Yes, do come back and visit us this Saturday. We'll have lots of books for sale.
10 till 4.
10 till 3.
10 till 3. Okay, so do come along. All sorts of bargains.
There's a whole bunch of new donations, so we're putting out a whole bunch of stuff we haven't organised, we've only priced it, so it's going to be a bunch of stuff you haven't seen before.
If anyone does want a book, incidentally, you can pick one up here at a discount to the retail price, or they're also available at several branches of Readings, the Avenue Bookstore, Demick's in Paran. I don't have them.
Perfect. Yes, so please come up and have a look if you haven't already. Also, take one of the last looks at our collective city exhibition, which is here in this room and on the other side of this wall. We've got it until the end of March. It relates to